Well, joining me now, Politico national political correspondent Meredith McGraw and Atlantic staff writer Mark Leibovich. Okay, so Meredith, we'll start with you on this one. During these back-to-back Washington events on anti-Semitism, Trump was reportedly trying to woo Jewish voters, but, I mean, what we heard there sounded like he was whining. He insulted Jewish leaders and engaged in what some would call anti-Semitic tropes. So how did the audience react to that?
Well, the first event that I was at, that I was covering for Politico, the audience was very receptive to Trump. He received multiple standing ovations. This was a group of people who have long been allies or donors of the former president. Some of the people in the room included members of Congress, senators, and congressmen, and some of his biggest Jewish supporters, including Miriam Adelson, who is backing one of the biggest PACs pushing Trump in the 2024 election, and some Jewish conservative group leaders, too. His remarks, though, were panned afterwards by the Harris campaign and by some Jewish organizations for leaning into anti-Semitic tropes, but some of the Jewish Republicans and conservatives that I talked to at the event said that they really feel like Trump is able in this election to make inroads with some Jewish voters, and Trump himself has been frustrated that he doesn't have more support. He's expressed that publicly and privately, and his campaign has seen and is tracking some numbers with him and Jewish voters in some of these battleground states where the election could be really tight. And Trump said on this, he said at these events that he feels that if he loses this election, that Jewish voters could be to blame for that. And I think that's because he's seen some of these numbers where he's tracking well with them, but it came across as a threat in some ways to Jewish voters.
Yeah. Mark, how do you believe Trump thinks this scolding approach to Jewish voters could help him? What's your take on this?
I have no idea. I mean, it looked very free associative. It wasn't whining so much as it just seemed just like kind of like your basic X-ray into his brain or something. Look, in the real world, if you sort of go out and you do a large poll of Jewish voters, I'm going to guess that there's not a single one out there who is going to say, well, I feel threatened, and therefore if I vote for Donald Trump, I will be safe, or something of this order. I mean, this is I don't think part of any effort to make inroads with Jewish voters. At least, I mean, if it is, I don't think it's going to be very effective. It's another window into how he views the world, which is very simplistic. It's really not a considered policy approach to this. And I don't know, frankly, I was just sort of rolling my eyes as I was watching it. So I don't quite know what impact, if any, it would have, but I don't imagine it will have much.
And before I move on quickly, Meredith, there's not one person that you spoke to at that event of his supporters who said, yeah, we're not comfortable with what he just said. Not one?
Nope, not one of the people that I talked to, at least at that event. It was organized by the campaign. It was a small event.
Okay. Mark, you've written extensively about Trump and how easily Republicans have bent to his will. And this week, Nikki Haley's Iowa State co-chair, Dawn Roberts, threw her support behind Kamala Harris. You've also written about Nikki Haley. So how significant is this with respect to Haley supporters overall?
I mean, I don't think, there are any Haley supporters out there who are looking to see, what this person was going to do. But I think that this is a significant voting bloc. I think, there are disaffected Republicans out there. Clearly, the Harris campaign is going after them because they exist. And you can say, oh, Liz Cheney doesn't speak for any Republicans. Well, yes, she does, because there are tens of millions. And, Nikki Haley voters are sort of a subset of this if you look to the more recent past. There are tens of millions of voters out there still alive, still voting, who voted for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. And many of them voted for Nikki Haley in the primaries or wanted to. And so, yeah, this is a large group, and I can't imagine Donald Trump is doing much to win them over these days.
Well, and to that end, Meredith, Nikki Haley suggested she'd campaign for Donald Trump. Is there any move from the Trump camp to make that happen? And would that help?
We saw that Nikki Haley, her name was used for a fundraising plea from the campaign recently, but Nikki Haley hasn't been out there on the trail with him. She said in interviews that she's offered up her support, but hasn't been asked. And as Mark was saying, there are a lot of these disaffected Republican voters who, the Harris campaign has tried to make inroads with. They've done outreach to. They appeared at the DNC, and it is surprising that the Trump campaign hasn't done more to use Haley and sort of the section of the Republican Party that she stands for in the final weeks of the campaign.
Mark, do you think Nikki Haley on the campaign trail would make an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I was at a Tim Walz rally yesterday. I mean, I would say I talked to about a half a dozen people who have been Republicans in the past, as recently as 2016, who have voted for Trump before. They are out there. Sure, Nikki Haley, if deployed thoughtfully or at all, would I think make a serious difference, because a lot of people, voted for her, and but they don't seem to have much interest in using her in any way, shape, or form.
Got to wonder if the campaign trusts her. But let's go from there, Meredith, to the new NBC News poll, which shows Harris leading Trump 49 to 44%. Harris also leads Trump by 9 points as the best candidate representing change, something that both candidates have been trying to claim. What does that number alone tell you? Are disengaged voters starting to pay attention and remember the chaos of the Trump presidency now?
I think you always see this in elections, that undecided voters, voters at large are really starting to tune in things, and we're now starting to have early voting. So people are starting to pay attention a little bit more. But, when we're looking at some of these numbers, one of the things that both camps are trying to do is turn out their base of supporters and have the sort of enthusiasm that's going to drive people to show up on the polls come rain or come shine in November. And one of the things that has stood out is at least in a recent Ann Selzer poll in Iowa and in others, is that Harris might have a little bit more enthusiasm among some of her supporters that could prove to be really effective when people are, deciding if they're going to actually show up or not. But I do think we've seen Harris ahead in some of these battleground state polls nationally, but overall things continue to be very tight.
So, Mark, what's your take on another debate? Is it too risky for Trump to have another poor performance so close to Election Day? I mean, is there even a possibility he could moderate his tone on the debate stage to reach independent voters?
Well, I mean, I think the risk maybe it would be more for Harris, just because she's winning, right? So she has more to lose. Although, as we saw from the last debate, I mean, it's clearly a format that suits her. And he seems to, I mean, even, after 6-7 weeks, seems to have no idea really how to engage with her or about her. And so, I think he's coming at this from a position of seemingly weakness. But I would think in some ways, between his ego and the deficit that he showed in the last debate, he would want to probably take another shot at this. But look, if Harris performs anywhere near as well as she did this last time, I can't see how that wouldn't be an asset for her, because frankly, I mean, she's the unknown entity here. People have a lot more to learn about her than they do about him. And if she can perform well, I think it's only going to solidify the small lead that she seems to have right now.
Yeah, speaking of learning about her, Meredith, Harris is making headlines about the comment that she made during a town hall with Oprah Winfrey, where she said she is a gun owner and that she would shoot anybody who tried to break into her home. Did that surprise you? Do you think these comments make her more appealing to conservative-leaning moderates and gun owners?
I think what she's trying to do really is maybe mollify or, I don't know, soothe some of the concerns that voters might have about Harris and gun rights, gun ownership, the Second Amendment, especially after some of the positions that she's held in the past. I didn't think it's super surprising that a former prosecutor did have a gun, but I think it was more about just trying to calm some fears people have that she might take away their guns.
Good point. Yeah. Okay. Meredith McGraw, Mark Leibovich. Good to see you both. Thank you, guys.